Everyone in the city feared him thanks to the power of misunderstanding. All he did was recommend books. He ran a quiet bookstore. He looked ordinary, mild-mannered, polite, and constantly short on customers. But after a known dark mage entered and called him master, and left with a rare book, rumors spread like wildfire. They wondered if he was a hidden god, a hermit sage, or something worse. Spies followed. Hunters investigated. They saw secrets in everything: his posture, his words, even his silence, thinking only a terrifying existence could fool them all. But the truth was completely different. Our MC had no aura, no spells, no strength, just kindness and coincidence. Rain poured heavily over the city, relentless and cold, the kind that made even the streets look tired. The station reported that the storm, which had started the night before, would continue for about a week. Drops fell steadily on the fabric awning above a small bookstore, tapping in a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. An open sign hung on the door, swaying slightly with the wind as if inviting someone in. Inside, a man in white gloves picked up a book from the shelf and looked around the empty shop with a quiet sigh, convinced that the rain had personally decided to ruin his business. Still, after a moment, the young man smiled and confidently assumed that someone would inevitably forget their umbrella and rush inside, because in his mind, fate worked in his favor. Closing his eyes, the owner of the bookstore mentally praised himself, already imagining how his kindness would impress customers, how his gentle behavior would create a warm atmosphere, and how that warmth would naturally turn into profit. There was a teapot and a cup of tea waiting on the table, prepared with almost suspicious precision, as if the entire situation had already been planned. At that exact same time, under the same rain, a sword flashed through the darkness, and a man's hand fell to the ground. Blood mixed with rainwater, spreading across the street as a woman stood surrounded by enemies. She swung her sword again, so fast that droplets of water rose into the air, blending with the red splashes. The bandits chased her, slipping and shouting, throwing knives in panic rather than skill. She turned to face them, barely dodging one attack before another struck her, proving that survival did not always require perfection, only persistence. Without hesitation, she threw her sword forward, the blade piercing straight through her opponent's head, while behind another man, something unnatural appeared. Demonic hands emerging from nowhere, one grabbing him by the hair, the other touching his cheek almost gently, before his neck snapped with a sharp sound. The woman pressed her hand against the wound, left by a thrown knife, blood dripping slowly before evaporating slightly from her body's heat. Looking at it, she calmly decided that it was not so bad that several of her ribs were broken, which revealed more about her situation than her words ever could. Leaning on her cane, she calculated that even with the effects of tainted blood, recovery would take at least an hour, meaning that without shelter, she would likely collapse long before that. The woman spotted a dim light ahead, a single bookstore still open in the storm. She slowed down immediately, her expression sharpening, because to her, such convenience could never be accidental. Her hand rested on her wound, which suddenly disappeared, and instead of relief, suspicion only grew stronger. The door burst open, the bell rang sharply, and wind rushed into the shop as she stepped inside, wet, wounded, and dangerous. Her heels echoed softly against the wooden floor as she scanned the surroundings carefully. The young man opened his eyes and looked toward the door, smiling as if he had predicted this exact moment. "I've been waiting," he said quietly, meaning nothing more than waiting for a customer. But as always, the power of misunderstanding twisted his words into something entirely different. The woman's gaze hardened. He had been waiting. To him, she was a rare and beautiful customer. To her, he was a man who had prepared everything in advance. She remained silent. He assumed she was shy. She assumed he was analyzing her. He stood and offered a towel, saying that she must be cold. He meant nothing more than kindness, but she saw preparation, calculation, intent. She took the towel slowly, as if accepting something far more dangerous than fabric. He smiled, satisfied with his service. She wiped her face, still watching him carefully, convinced that every move was part of a larger plan. He poured tea and commented that she looked like she had been through something difficult. To him, it was a casual guess. To her, her it was confirmation. When he added that it might be related to relationship problems, his confidence rose, while her shock deepened instantly. In her mind, there was no longer any doubt. This man knew everything. She sat down cautiously and admitted that she had been betrayed. He nodded with complete confidence, interpreting the situation as simple heartbreak. She, however, saw it as proof that he had already understood the truth. He spoke about greed, about people, about not forgiving those who hurt her, believing he was offering general advice. She heard something entirely different, an order, a direction, a path. When he said she needed to move forward, he meant letting go of the past. She understood advancing toward revenge. When he told her to focus on herself, he meant self-improvement. She understood becoming stronger to eliminate her enemies. Slowly, her presence changed, her aura darkening slightly, while he simply believed she was becoming more motivated. Finally, she asked what she should do. He looked at her and, without much thought, told her to take revenge. He meant emotional closure. She heard destiny itself. Silence filled the room as the rain outside grew louder, as if emphasizing the moment. The misunderstanding had reached its peak, growing into something neither of them could control. She looked at him with new understanding, convinced she was standing before a mastermind guiding her path. He looked at her with satisfaction, convinced he had successfully convinced a customer. She asked one last question, whether she should truly turn away from them. He told her not to hesitate, meaning confidence, while she heard permission to destroy everything. He added that it was the best choice, meaning emotionally, while she understood strategically. At last, he placed a book on the table and said that it would help her. The cover reflected the dim light, a faint yellow glow catching her attention. To him, it was simply a good product. To her, it was a forbidden artifact. While he leaned back in his chair, completely satisfied with himself. Looking at it with fear, the elf held the book tightly, her fingers slightly trembling as she thought that she was hearing about a book called Blood and Beast for the first time, and she could not understand why this man had decided to give her something so obviously dangerous, while in reality, the merchant was simply proud that he had picked what he believed was a very cool-looking book that might emotionally resonate with her. The stranger slowly opened the book, and in her vision, blood immediately poured out of the pages like a living stream, her body sinking into the scarlet liquid as sharp fangs surrounded her, red tentacles wrapping around her as a giant wolf opened its mouth, its eyes overflowing with blood that poured directly into the cup of tea in front of her, creating a horrifying scene that existed only in her perception, while in reality, she was just staring silently at printed text for a slightly uncomfortable amount of time. The woman instantly closed the book with force, her breathing unstable, while the merchant blinked in confusion, wondering if the font size was too small. In her mind, a syringe appeared before a monstrous werewolf, explaining the horrifying truth that transformation into a beast was a power obtained through tainted blood, something hunters used despite its deadly risks. And as she pressed the book against her chest, she recalled that the higher the concentration of such blood, the greater the strength, but also the greater the chance of death, while in reality, the book simply contained dramatic metaphors that the merchant himself had barely read. She looked at him with shock, realizing that if this method of controlling tainted blood was real, it could completely destroy the entire power system of the hunters, and she asked him seriously if he truly intended for her to do this, while he simply placed his hand on the table and nodded, thinking she was asking whether she should follow his life advice. He calmly said that she didn't need to act out of regret, but instead should be honest with herself, narrowing his eyes slightly as he noticed that despite her strong appearance, she seemed emotionally hurt, while she interpreted his words as permission to abandon hesitation and walk a path of blood. The girl trembled slightly, overwhelmed, while the boy misunderstood completely and thought that his comforting words had deeply moved her, proudly concluding that recommending a good book and speaking gently was enough to bring anyone to tears. The owner of the shop placed his hand on her shoulder, believing he was offering reassurance, while she felt as if a powerful entity was placing a seal upon her. He then decided to quote what he believed to be a meaningful line from the book, raising his hand and saying that the trumpets would sound and that one day he would stand before judgment with this very book in his hands, his tone filled with dramatic quiet confidence, while she interpreted this as a prophecy of an inevitable future where he would judge all beings. A faint blue aura surrounded her, or at least that was how she perceived the situation, while in reality he was just leaning slightly forward with enthusiasm. He continued speaking, saying that every person had basic animal desires and that she should accept them in order to start a new life, believing he was giving philosophical advice, while she understood that he was telling her to embrace the beast within and awaken her true power. The woman pressed her lips together, struggling to remain calm, while he mentally imagined himself as a teacher giving a perfect lesson in eloquence, convinced that his words were structured, meaningful, and effective. He raised his cup of tea and prolonged a toast to a completely new future, smiling with satisfaction, while she lifted her cup as if accepting a pact that would change her destiny forever. She thanked him seriously and promised to follow his advice, her voice filled with determination, while he nodded proudly, convinced that he had successfully helped her move on from heartbreak. She then drank the tea in one motion, despite it being extremely hot, shocking him completely as he stared in disbelief, wondering how she had managed to drink it so casually, while she believed that enduring pain was part of the ritual. Frowning, the boy reassured himself that everything was fine, and briefly wondered if this was some kind of special constitution, while she believed that the process had already begun. He placed a library card on the table and asked her to fill it out, seeing it as a normal procedure, while she looked at it seriously, as if signing a contract that bound her to something far greater. She picked up the pen and wrote her name, her movements careful and deliberate, while he glanced at it and suddenly recognized the surname, recalling that it belonged to a powerful figure in the underground world. His expression changed slightly as he squeezed the card, realizing that this girl might be far more important than he initially thought, and he quietly decided that this was a very valuable customer, while she noticed his reaction and became even more convinced that he knew her identity all along. He stood up and explained calmly that the book could be borrowed for a month, with a short delay allowed, thinking about stable income, while she interpreted it as a time limit for completing her mission. He handed her an umbrella and told her not to forget it when she returned, meaning nothing more than practical advice, while she understood it as an instruction that she must come back after fulfilling her task. She placed her hand on her chest and thanked him sincerely, then asked if they could get to know each other better, testing him carefully, while he was momentarily surprised and wondered if his words had sounded like flirting. Trying to remain respectful, he introduced himself as an ordinary but helpful bookstore owner, while she immediately understood that he was deliberately hiding his true identity. Holding her cane, she concluded that although he refused to reveal himself, he was at least on her side. She opened the umbrella and left, wishing him good night, while he waved casually and stretched his arms, satisfied that he had done a good deed. He smiled to himself, believing that helping others like this was the meaning of his life. While outside, the woman walked through the rain, calling him creepy under her breath, yet fully convinced that she needed to deal with the traitor as soon as possible and then return to him. Suddenly, she froze. A dark silhouette appeared ahead. She gripped her cane tightly, her expression turning serious as she realized that the mission had already begun. Far behind her, inside the bookstore, the young man picked up another book with a black cover titled Rituals and Magic, smiling slightly as memories surfaced. He remembered his old life, sitting in a university library, obsessed with books, staying late while others left, ignoring reality in favor of pages. He remembered the night he drew a magic circle, not believing it would work, yet still wishing for all the books in the world. He remembered the moment a gate appeared, a burning eye staring at him, offering him everything at the cost of never returning, and he remembered smiling and accepting. Now, years later, he stood in a quiet bookstore, living peacefully, reading, selling books, and enjoying simple life. He took a sip of tea and smiled, convinced that nothing extraordinary had happened today. Outside, under the rain, the elf's face broke out in cold sweat as a black silhouette was reflected in her eyes, her body freezing instinctively as a stranger stranger walked down the street under the pouring rain, holding a book in one hand and an umbrella in the other, his steps calm and steady while raindrops gathered at his feet, as if avoiding him rather than falling on him. The two passed each other in silence. Yet the moment the wind lifted the man's cloak slightly, the girl's mouth opened in fear, her teeth clenching as her body refused to move, her hand frozen tightly around her cane, as if even breathing had become dangerous. The old man slowly turned his head and looked back at her, a faint grin appearing on his face as he said that she was lucky to have such a book. His tone casual, almost friendly, yet in her mind, his words echoed like a warning from something far beyond human. For a brief moment, she imagined her body being wrapped by a giant snake, suffocating, unable to escape, her vision tightening as fear gripped her completely. She forced herself to look back again, only to see the stranger holding a book titled Emptiness, the simple word sending a chill down her spine as if it contained something far deeper than it appeared. Without saying a word, the huntress quickly turned into a nearby alley, her grip loosening as the umbrella slipped from her hand and fell to the ground, rolling slightly with the rain. Her body slid down the wall as she tried to steady her breathing, her mind racing as she wondered what exactly she had just encountered. Meanwhile, the stranger calmly continued walking, eventually approaching the bookstore as if nothing unusual had happened, pushing the door open as the bell rang once again. He adjusted his hat slightly, and the merchant looked up, immediately smiling as he greeted him and casually called him by name, clearly recognizing him as a returning customer. The old man smiled broadly, while inside he was slightly surprised that the shop owner had dared to say his name so casually, though at the same time he noticed that there was a new presence nearby. At the door, the girl had returned silently, her body pressed against the wall as she listened, her mind still shaken. The old man spoke, saying that the book confession was too difficult to understand, explaining that based on his superficial knowledge, it was hard to imagine how great the person who wrote it must be, while the merchant simply scratched his cheek slightly, unsure whether to feel proud or embarrassed. Leaning against the wall outside, the woman recalled fragments of information, her mind connecting pieces together as if assembling a terrifying puzzle. In her memory, a torn document appeared, following the classification rules of a secret society, dividing supernatural beings into 4 levels: abnormal, frightening, destructive, and indescribable. On a blood-stained table lay a mask, marked by dark green snake-like eyes, the symbol of a being known as the Black Faceless. A wanted poster, pierced by a blade, described a battle that had destroyed an area spanning thousands of kilometers, elevating that being to the destructive level, one of the rarest and most dangerous existences in the world. The elf lowered her head slightly, recalling that there were less than 10 such beings in the entire region, and less than 100 in the whole world. And yet, that same existence was now calmly standing inside a bookstore, talking. She smiled nervously, wondering if it was even possible to have a normal conversation with such a monster. Inside, the merchant placed a book back on the shelf and noticed that his customer seemed to be in a bad mood, casually offering help, completely unaware that he was speaking to someone capable of destroying entire regions. With his back turned, he remembered that this was one of his few regular customers, someone who came not for books but for company, and he felt slightly responsible for keeping him comfortable. The old man sat at the table, his expression calm, though his past was anything but, filled with broken relationships, abandoned connections, and a long history of being misunderstood himself. The merchant smiled slightly, recalling the first time they met 2 years ago, when the man had entered the shop hidden under a hood, his instincts telling him that this was an interesting customer, though his definition of interesting was far less dangerous than reality. Back then, he had simply assumed that the man was a researcher, perhaps a linguist or scholar, and had carefully tried to start a conversation, offering tea and asking casual questions, believing he was dealing with a lonely intellectual. When the man revealed part of his face, marked by strange scars, the shop owner had only thought that it was a bit unusual, deciding politely not to ask further, while the man himself had been shocked that someone could look at him without fear. here. Now, sitting in the present, the merchant examined the books brought by his customer and casually commented that they contained studies of rare and even dead languages, smiling as he added that it was fascinating how magic could exist between words and lines, speaking metaphorically. The old man froze, his eyes widened slightly, because to him, that was not a metaphor, that was truth. He stared at the shop owner, realizing that despite hiding all traces of magic, despite erasing his aura completely, this young man had somehow seen through everything. Meanwhile, the merchant simply smiled, proud of his poetic expression. The power of misunderstanding deepened. The old man began to see him not as a normal human, but as something unknown, something hidden, something far more dangerous than himself. The merchant, on the other hand, concluded that his customer was simply impressed by his knowledge. When asked about books on similar topics, the shop owner casually recommended one, internally amused because it was known as an extremely difficult dialect that almost no one could understand. The moment the old man touched the book, his body trembled, the cup of tea cracking slightly on the table as his hands shook, his mind recognizing it instantly. "The language of the devil," he muttered. The merchant blinked, surprised that his joke nickname had been taken seriously. The old man, however, looked at the book with excitement, as if he had just found a lost treasure. The merchant clenched his fist slightly, proud that his recommendation had been successful. The old man, meanwhile, began to suspect something even deeper, that this bookstore owner might be connected to an ancient civilization tied to forbidden knowledge. When the merchant casually described it as a glorious ancient culture, the old man felt a strange sense of nostalgia in his words, interpreting it as hidden truth rather than casual imagination. A faint, dark pressure seemed to surround the merchant, or at least that was how the old man perceived it, as he began to question what kind of existence he was truly facing. Yet the young man simply extended his hand and politely asked for his name, smiling as if nothing unusual was happening. The old man introduced himself, bowing slightly, while internally raising his guard even higher. The merchant told him not to be so formal, completely unaware that his casual attitude was only increasing the tension. They continued talking, one believing he was helping a lonely scholar, the other believing he had encountered something beyond understanding. The protagonist scratched his chin thoughtfully and said that he needed some time to think, his tone casual and relaxed, as if he were deciding between two ordinary books, while in front of him sat a being who could destroy cities. Leaving the main hall for a moment, he casually sat back down on his chair, completely at ease, while the dark magician watched him in silence and mentally praised him, convinced that he was witnessing true generosity and selflessness beyond mortal understanding. In his mind, memories resurfaced. Joseph tearing off his own arm during a brutal battle 2 years ago, the kind of scene that defined power and madness. Yet compared to the man in front of him, even that felt insignificant. The young man spread his arms slightly as he stood near the shelf, holding a book, looking like someone casually helping a customer, while in Frank's eyes, he had become a guide, a being who led others toward the correct path of existence. Frank lowered his gaze, thinking deeply about how this shop owner could casually handle the rarest texts in existence while completely hiding his aura, something that should have been impossible. Slowly clasping his hands, he reached a terrifying conclusion that the person in front of him was not just powerful, but something beyond divine understanding, a hidden hermit who had transcended all known limits. Meanwhile, the young man was simply wondering which book looked more interesting. The old man realized that with such guidance, he could finally begin researching forbidden spells using knowledge from these texts, while the shop owner was just hoping the recommendation wouldn't be too boring. The black faceless smiled slightly, deciding to express his gratitude, just as the shop owner returned to the table holding another book titled Rituals and Magic, apologizing lightly for its weight, as if the only concern here was physical inconvenience rather than existential danger. Handing the book over, he called himself a bit presumptuous and said that it might suit him, while the dark mage carefully raised his hands to receive it like like a sacred artifact. On the cover, a red eye stared outward. The shopkeeper scratched his cheek and casually warned that he wasn't very confident about this research. Frank froze. His eyes widened in pure shock. He jumped up from his chair and asked if this book was his. The boy straightened his tie slightly and replied, almost shyly, that he was even a little embarrassed by it. Silence. The old man's mouth slowly fell open as his mind exploded into chaos. In his imagination, the priests of ancient cults opened forbidden scriptures. Followers climbed mountains seeking truth. Shadows of powerful organizations stretched across the world, and now all of it pointed to one conclusion. This man was creating his own system, his own faith, his own path. Looking at the book, sensing what he believed to be a deep and dangerous aura, the dark mage cautiously asked if rituals were his field of research. The young man lowered his head slightly and confirmed it, adding that this research had changed his fate, meaning his life circumstances, while the old man heard something entirely different, a transformation that transcended existence itself. The shopkeeper then quickly added that it was all in the past and asked him to forget about it, waving it off casually. The old man stared at him, tension rising. Forget? To him, that meant something forbidden, something sealed, something not meant to be spoken of. He slowly concluded that the man before him was a scholar of taboo knowledge, someone expelled from greater society, forced to hide in this quiet bookstore while holding unimaginable power. The merchant, meanwhile, simply thought, yeah, publishing is hard. Looking down at the book, the shop owner casually explained that he had no way to publish it, so he only had a handmade version, while Frank interpreted this as, this knowledge cannot be allowed to spread. Closing his eyes briefly, the young man imagined the life he would have had if he had stayed in his original world, perhaps becoming a professor, publishing freely, while the dark mage saw this as a being who had abandoned fame willingly. Then, suddenly, the young man extended his hand and offered the book. He said simply that since they shared similar interests, he would lend it to him. The black faceless froze. His eyes widened in disbelief. This priceless, one-of-a-kind manuscript was being given to him, just like that. Looking up slowly, he wondered what this man truly wanted, thanking him deeply, while internally preparing for a hidden condition or price. He called it a painstaking work, emphasizing that it existed in only one copy, his voice heavy with meaning. The shop owner misunderstood completely, thinking his customer felt guilty for taking it. So he placed a hand on his shoulder and reassured him, saying not to worry, that he could always make another copy, and that knowledge in his head could never be stolen. The dark mage's mind went blank. He doesn't care about uniqueness. He doesn't care about value, the young man continued, smiling, saying that fame and fortune didn't matter to him. Frank opened his mouth in shock. At that moment, the misunderstanding reached a terrifying height. He believed he was standing before a being who had transcended all worldly desires. The merchant, meanwhile, believed he was comforting a slightly shy customer. Looking at him, the shop owner even thought that his friend might be too focused on material things and decided to guide him toward a healthier mindset, believing he was helping him socially. The dark mage bowed deeply, thanking him for his wisdom, convinced he had received guidance far beyond books. The merchant scratched his nose awkwardly and casually added that he wouldn't mind if he recommended the book to others. The old man froze again. He's testing me. He wants to see if I can protect this knowledge. He smiled and promised to do his best, while internally deciding to hide the truth at all costs. As he walked toward the exit, he concluded that this was the price he had to pay, to preserve this knowledge without exposing it. The merchant, meanwhile, thought, nice, free marketing. Before leaving, the dark mage reached into a portal and pulled out a gargoyle statue, offering it as a small token of gratitude. The shop owner frowned slightly, asking what it was. The old man humbly explained that it was not very valuable. In reality, it was a combat entity rivaling elite warriors. The young man took it, examined it, and concluded that it was a very elegant decoration, perfect for the shop. He smiled and praised it as a beautiful piece of art, even saying he would look forward to the next gift. The old man nearly lost his composure. He thought, he knows. It's nothing to him. He's sparing my pride. The misunderstanding misunderstanding deepened once more. After a final farewell, the dark mage left, promising to bring something even more valuable next time, while the shop owner waved casually, already thinking about where to place his new decoration. Looking at the gargoyle, he wondered if he could get another one to make a pair, even questioning if they had genders, completely ignoring the terrifying power contained within it. Stretching his arms, he sighed in satisfaction, believing the day had gone well and that maintaining a clear mind naturally attracted good fortune. At that exact moment, a drop of black liquid fell onto the table. He looked back. Another drop formed. Then slowly the liquid twisted and shaped itself into words. "Long time no see." The young man stared at it, his expression shifting from calm to confused. He asked quietly if it was really that. The dark substance rose into the air, shifting and moving unnaturally. He frowned slightly, finally realizing that something was wrong. After 3 years, the being responsible for bringing him into this world had returned. The young man slowly raised his hand and calmly assumed that it was finally time to pay the price for crossing into another world. His expression serious for a moment, as if he were about to face something grand, while in reality he was mostly worried about whether the price would be financially inconvenient. Putting his hand on his chin, the shopkeeper recalled that the unknown being had technically helped him achieve his dream of owning endless books, and casually concluded that such a being must belong to some good god category, wondering if the fee would be something reasonable like occasional cooperation or maybe a membership system. Suddenly, his eyebrows lifted. The black liquid on the table twisted and formed words. "Z has awakened. He is searching." The shopkeeper froze. His mouth opened slightly as he immediately jumped to the most logical conclusion in his mind. He asked almost nervously if this happened because he allowed Frank to recommend his book. The slime calmly drew a symbol of agreement. The boy blinked, then raised his hand again and asked seriously if he now needed to force more people to recommend and distribute his book. He even smiled slightly and asked if this was beneficial for him. The symbol didn't change. To him, that meant confirmation. To the unknown being, it was just observing. The young man nodded confidently and promised to do his best, already planning a future where his bookstore somehow became aggressively popular. The black liquid jumped lightly on the table as if satisfied. The misunderstanding had now officially escalated into a business strategy. Outside, rain continued to fall. On a nearby balcony, a hooded figure stood silently. Jack frowned while reporting through a communication device that a suspect related to the Hunters' conflict had been located on 23rd Street in Nausen, that the target had spent over an hour inside a bookstore, and suggested that the place might actually be a secret base for dark mages. His companion widened her eyes in shock, immediately promising to report everything to their teacher after gathering more information. Suddenly, Frank appeared behind Jack. His voice was calm, too calm. He commented that his enemy was surprisingly bold. Jack spun around instantly and swung his knife. The attack never landed. Frank grabbed him by the mask, looked down, and casually wished him death. A giant dragon burst out, and the mercenary died instantly. From the communication device on the ground, his partner's voice continued speaking, completely unaware. Frank stepped on the corpse, adjusted his hat, and coldly warned anyone who dared to investigate that bookstore not to even think about regretting death. Then he glanced toward the shop. The lights were still on, peaceful, warm, completely normal, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Elsewhere, a report was delivered. A knock echoed. A girl entered an office and announced an abnormal case. Joseph, the head of intelligence, removed his glasses and sighed deeply like a man who had already had enough problems for one lifetime. When he heard the report about Frank, his expression changed instantly. Shock, anger, interest, all at once. The moment he learned that the dark mage had spent over an hour inside a normal bookstore, he slammed his hand on the table, declaring loudly that it was absolutely impossible, because in his understanding, a dark mage who gained power through language would never waste time reading books like a normal person. The entire room fell silent. because what he just said was actually correct, but also completely wrong. Documents were presented. The bookstore had existed for 3 years. Good reputation. Very few customers. Owned by the Ash Chamber of Commerce. Nothing suspicious, except the owner, a foreigner. Calm. Ordinary. Too ordinary. Joseph frowned deeply, because in a world full of monsters, ordinary was the most suspicious thing possible. The discussion escalated. The druids were mentioned. Funding percentages were mentioned. At one point, Joseph called them problematic vegetarians. His subordinate silently disagreed, but wisely chose not to argue. Then he snapped, declared that they could not compromise with darkness, and made a final decision. He would personally go to the bookstore. Meanwhile, inside the bookstore, the protagonist stretched lazily, completely unaware that multiple organizations, assassins, and high-level officials were currently revolving their entire attention around him. He simply thought, business is finally improving.